Dear students, let's continue our discussion on international ethics. Let's start from where we left last time. In the previous lecture, we had discussed the various situations in which international relations can be evaluated from a perspective of international ethics and where international ethics are most required. We had begun by explaining what is the international space, and in that context, some scenarios that we had discussed last time were the international economy, ecological systems, interdependence between nations, diplomatic relations, defense and military enterprises, poverty and inequality between nations. In today's lecture, we shall continue with the discussion on international ethics within various situations in the international space and also look at some theories of international ethics. Let's begin by discussing an important issue that holds relevance on the domestic as well as the international front, that is the issue of freedom of speech. There are many stakeholders involved in the matter of freedom of speech, namely the international press and media, the education sectors, cultural expressions, exchanges and products, and so on. Freedom of speech is a sensitive issue because any controversial speech can have a direct impact on international peace and security. There are some important aspects of freedom of speech that need to be weighed in terms of ethics. One contentious issue is religion, which plays an important role in international relations. Freedom of speech can be about religious expression, which may favor a certain religion and can be perceived by another group as an attack on their religion. Managing such tensions, restraining war on the basis of religion, analyzing what speech can be polarizing becomes the responsibility of international organizations as well as the international media. International media ethics are an important aspect of international ethics. We need international media ethics to responsibly share correct information to the global public in a just and non-polarizing manner, to scrutinize whether ways of gathering and spreading news are ethical or not, for an honest representation of world affairs without any biases, and finally, to blow the whistle on nations when they're doing wrong and unjustly pushing their own agenda. From ethics of freedom of speech to another issue is freedom to information. Freedom of information is another driver for international ethics that are impacted by the global flow of information. Ethical scrutiny of freedom of information concerns issues like access to information, availability of data, e-learning, privacy, censorship, consent, fake news, mass surveillance technologies, digital divides and inequalities, and so on. These are some very important issues that need to be deliberated upon sensitively. The freedom to information is also a key tool in combating corruption and wrongdoing in the government. An aspect of freedom to information that's often neglected is the use of this to facilitate effective business practices. Commercial users are in many countries one of the most significant user groups. There has been a veritable revolution in recent years in terms of the right to access information held by public bodies. Whereas in 1990, only 13 countries had adopted national right to information laws, upward of 70 such laws have now been adopted globally, and they are under active consideration in another 20 to 30 countries. Today, most countries have a Right to Information Act as well as a Data Protection Act. Freedom of information is peculiar because it involves and concerns the individual, the personal, the public, as well as national authorities. Freedom of information, especially in relation to technology, is a profound subject matter that requires ethical scrutiny as data is becoming one of the most precious resources of our times and it has to be put to use ethically. Another important topic in international ethics, which is on the lines of information, is the topic of scientific research agendas and projects. Science has played a major role in global developments. Scientific research ethics vary by discipline as well as by country. Technological developments, inquiries about space, sending space missions, inventions of new medicine, matters of climate change, and so on are some of the few scientific issues that concern us globally, and many nations have research teams that are making newer scientific developments. Ethics are important in scientific work as they set standards and rules for research and influence the implications of scientific discoveries. International ethics may also have a lot to do with new and current epistemologies that are bound to shape the thinking of the present and the future generations. International ethics in scientific research need to understand ethical concerns like a scientific work's duty to society, beneficence, conflict of interest, informed consent, integrity, non-discrimination, non-exploitation, privacy, as well as confidentiality. If we understand ethics in very simple terms, it's a relationship that one human being has with another, and this relationship extends to other spheres of existence and society as well. Now, an important aspect of human relationships is the power dynamic between them. A similar power dynamic plays out between nations, where it is seen often that the most resourceful nations become powerful and take over resources of other nations too. In today's times, it's not just a question of nations having power over the other, but also the growing power of non-state actors, like multinational corporations that have great economical, political, and social reach. Power is a deep and important philosophical concept, with ideas ranging from philosophers like Nietzsche to realist political thinkers who believe that human nature is constantly power-hungry and works only towards its own selfish interests. But the ethical approach goes beyond these insights to account for the real weight of responsibility towards the global community conscience, principles, and opting to do the right thing in the benefit of others and for social harmony. Now that we know the various contexts of international ethics, let's get into the philosophy of international ethics. There are certain theoretical traditions within international ethics that we all must know about. The traditions of international ethics are primarily the realist, idealist, constructivist, contractarian, and Marxist. Ethical traditions, however, are not set in stone. They are traditions of argument and thus have a room for varied perspectives and opinions. Let us now explore the various traditions in international ethics that have existed and evolved over time. The first tradition of analysis is the realist tradition. The realist tradition can be divided into classical realism and 20th century realism. The essence of international realism is its belief in the primacy of self-interest over moral principle. Features that are essential to realism are belief in the primacy of the nation-state, the principle that states behave rationally, and the balance of power. All realists agree that international space is inherently anarchic, which means that it lacks any central order-enforcing power. Since ethical restraints are not enforced in this space, they lose their binding character. Realists often speak in terms of necessity, which is that international conditions compel states to defend their interests frequently by immoral means, and this compulsion of self-defense suspends all moral duties. Realists perceive the international space to be intrinsically at a state of war. This phrase state of war can be seen in the works of Thomas Hobbes and Rousseau. And the phrase doesn't mean that states are always fighting with each other, but that they are in a perpetual state of opposition or conflict of interest that may make them break into conflict with each other at any time. Realists believe that if there is a society of nations, it's not strong enough to overcome this state of war. If there is a common good among states, it's not significant enough to outweigh the conflict of interest between them. No actual international institutions or any reasonably to be expected have the capacity to remedy this situation. States are left to fend for themselves in a space that places them all at risk. The realist approach denies the need for shared ethics between states and demands an ethics-neutral or an ethics-free zone because they argue that universal moral principles cannot be applied to the actions of states. Now let's understand the 20th century realist perspective. Egoism, anarchy, and power in international relations define the basic structure of the realist tradition of international ethics. Let's get into these terms briefly. Egoism. Human nature is the starting point for realism, and the core of human nature for realists lies in the egoistic passions, which makes individuals pursue their own selfish interests over the others. Anarchy does not imply chaos or the complete absence of order. Rather, anarchy is the absence of political rule or a hierarchical political order based on subordination and authority. Realism speaks of an international relations taking place in an anarchical society, which implies an ordered society of states, but one without an international government. The third aspect is of power, which realists believe that there needs to be a balance of power among states. The pursuit of power must be a primary objective of any state, where power and security must be the primary objectives of both the internal and external policy of the state. Realists base their arguments on human nature as being innately selfish. However, some realists argue on the basis of how moral principles are relative and cannot be applied across countries and cultures. There are some jarring criticisms of the realist perspective that we must also look into. The first criticism is that though in extreme situations like in a state of war, nations do compromise morally, yet this does not and cannot signify the collapse of morality completely. Secondly, in the actual practice of states, a great deal of mutually beneficial cooperation does take place. This cooperation and interdependence that goes with it are self-sustaining. Not having a formalized set of rules does not mean that there is necessarily lawlessness. Ultimately, peace, though sometimes fragile, nevertheless has a substantial reality in international politics. Now let's move on to the next tradition, which is the idealist tradition. Idealism focuses on the common interest between nations and not on the balance of power. Idealism is a belief in a universal code of morality and objective ethical standards. The term idealism in the context of international relation refers to an approach of international politics that seeks certain common moral goals or ideals for the world. For example, making the world more just or peaceful. Idealism supports the rise of the global marketplace and the growing interdependence between nations. Idealism is the counter to the realist approach, and the idealists give a lot of importance to international treaties, the UN, trade and communications between nations, etc. One small criticism of idealism is that this tradition theoretically presupposes that the current world system is inadequate and they underestimate the achievements of the existing order. Now, let's shift to another approach, which is the tradition of constructivism. Constructivism has been interpreted in two ways. First, that the structures of human association are determined primarily by the shared ideas rather than material forces. Second, that the identities and interests of states are constructed by these shared ideas rather than given by nature. Constructivism is another approach which is opposed to the realist approach, as it focuses on foreign policy, diplomatic initiatives and local initiatives for more global interactions to create an international space. Constructivism allows for the influence of national identities and its constructions on the international sphere. Constructivism majorly focuses on the needs of the individual nation and how goals of individual nations can construct common ideals in the international space. Another approach that we should discuss is the contractarian approach. The contractarian position is based on the social contract theory that presupposes the fundamental freedom and equality of all those entering into a political arrangement and the associated rights that follow from the principles of freedom and equality. It's a consensus upon which all parties agree, where all are free and equal and they don't impose their power over one another. The application of the social contract theory to domestic context dates back to ancient Greeks. John Rawls is a philosopher who is widely credited with resurrecting the social contract tradition in the 20th century. His thoughts hold special significance for the international social context as he extends the contractual approach ethics into the international system. The last tradition that we must consider is the Marxist tradition. What we must know is that neither ethics nor international relations are notions that sit easily within a Marxist framework, and there is no single Marxist ethical tradition with respect to international affairs. Examining Marxist approaches to the states and international relations is thus general attitudes and predispositions rather than a fully worked through theory or philosophy. In terms of Marxist theory of base and superstructure, one may say that ethics can be considered as an aspect of the superstructure, and the material conditions that influence these ethics are the base. There are, however, many critiques of the separateness of the base and structure because in many ways they are interdependent. Moral ideas in Marxist thoughts are not fixed moral principles. They are constantly changing, but overall one can say that they are against the concentration of power in a way that exploits a certain group. Marxist thought would provoke the working class to oppose the predatory foreign policies of various governments. They would not make decisions solely for profit, but for a scenario where workers have full control over the means of production. Now finally, let's sum up by asking, what does international ethics do? First, they tell us that in every situation we have a choice to make an ethically sound judgment and action. Second, it tells us that every matter of international relations can be seen from an ethical lens. Then, it tells us that decisions of the world can't be only made on the basis of economic and political gains. We also need to make more ecological and sustainable decisions. If you have to make a decision about which world would you want to live in without knowing the position from which you're coming from, you would choose a world that protects the weakest of the weak, the least advantaged. Such a world is full of the meaning of life, and in such a world, the equality of all life becomes the primary principle. That every life on planet needs to be seen with the same lens, though that may be extremely difficult to currently envision because we divide people in terms of citizens and refugees. Ultimately, the study of international ethics tells us that though contexts may differ, there are a number of frameworks available for making decisions concerning international actions which have economic, social, and environmental consequences and impacts over future generations.